more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Sinking of the Titanic and Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 6. Women and Children First. Cool-headed officers and crew bring order out of chaos. Filling the lifeboats. Heart-rending scenes as families are parted. 4 lifeboats lost. Incidents of bravery. The boats are filled. Once on the deck, many hesitated to enter the swinging lifeboats. The glassy sea, the starlit sky, the absence, in the first few moments, of intense excitement gave them the feeling that there was only some slight mishap, that those who got into the boats would have a chilly half-hour below and might later be laughed at. It was such a feeling as this, from all accounts, which caused John Jacob Astor and his wife to refuse the places offered them in the first boat and to retire to the gymnasium. In the same way, H.J. Allison, a Montreal banker, laughed at the warning, and his wife, reassured by him, took her time dressing. They and their daughter did not reach the Carpathia. Their son, less than 2 years old, was carried into a lifeboat by his nurse and was taken in charge by Major Arthur Hughes. The lifeboats lowered. The admiration felt by the passengers and crew for the matchlessly appointed vessel was translated, in those first few moments, into a confidence which, for some, proved deadly. The pulsing of the engines had ceased, and the steamship lay just as though she were awaiting the order to go on again after some trifling matter had been adjusted. But in a few minutes, the canvas covers were lifted from the lifeboat, and the crews allotted to each standing by, ready to lower them into the water. Nearly all the boats that were lowered on the port side of the ship touched the water without capsizing. 4 of the others lowered to starboard, including one collapsible, were capsized. All, however, who were in the collapsible boats that practically went to pieces were rescued by the other boats. Presently, the order was heard. All men stand back and all women retire to the deck below. That was the smoking room deck, or the B deck. The men stood away and remained in absolute silence, leaning against the rail or pacing up and down the deck slowly. Many of them lighted cigars or cigarettes and began to smoke. Loading the boats. The boats were swung out and lowered from the A deck above. The women were marshaled quietly in lines along the B deck, and when the boats were lowered down to the level of the ladder, the women were assisted to climb into them. As each of the boats was filled with its quota of passengers, the word was given, and it was carefully lowered down to the dark surface of the water. Nobody seemed to know how Mr. Ismay got into a boat, but it was assumed that he wished to make a presentation of the case of the Titanic to his company. He was among those who apparently realized that the splendid ship was doomed. All hands in the lifeboats, under instructions from officers and men in charge, were rowed a considerable distance from the ship herself in order to get away from the possible suction that would follow her foundering. Coolest men on board. Captain Smith and Major Archibald Butt, military aide to the President of the United States, were among the coolest men on board. A number of steerage passengers were yelling and screaming and fighting to get to the boats. Officers drew guns and told them that if they moved toward the boats, they would be shot dead. Major Butt had a gun in his hand and covered the men who tried to get to the boats. The following story of his bravery was told by Mrs. Henry B. Harris, wife of the theatrical manager. The world should rise in praise of Major Butt. That man's conduct will remain in my memory forever. The American Army is honored by him and the way he taught some of the other men how to behave when women and children were suffering that awful mental fear of death. Major Butt was near me, and I noticed everything that he did. When the order to man the boat came, the captain whispered something to Major Butt. The 2 of them had become friends. The major immediately became as one in supreme command. You would have thought he was at a White House reception. A dozen or more women became hysterical all at once as something connected with a lifeboat went wrong. Major Butt stepped over to them and said, "Really, you must not act like that. We were all going to see you through this thing." He helped the sailors rearrange the rope or chain that had gone wrong and lifted some of the showed gallantry. Not only was there a complete lack of any fear in his manner, but there was the action of an aristocrat. When the time came, he was a man to be feared. In one of the earlier boats, 50 women, it seemed, were about to be lowered when a man, suddenly panic-stricken, ran to the stern of it. Major Butt shot one arm out, caught him by the back of the neck, and jerked him backward like a pillow. His head cracked against a rail, and he was stunned. "Sorry," said Major Butt. "Women will be attended to first, or I'll break every damn bone in your body." Forced men usurping places to vacate. The boats were lowered one by one, and as I stood by, my husband said to me, "Thank God for Archie Butt." Perhaps Major Butt heard it, for he turned his face towards us for a second and smiled. Just at that moment, a young man was arguing to get into a lifeboat, and Major Butt had a hold of the lad by the arm, like a big brother, and was telling him to keep his head and be a man. Major Butt helped those poor frightened steerage people so wonderfully, so tenderly, and yet with such cool and manly firmness that he prevented the loss of many lives from panic. He was a soldier to the last. He was one of God's greatest noblemen, and I think I can say he was an example of bravery, even to men on the ship. Last words of Major Butt. Miss Marie Young, who was a music instructor to President Roosevelt's children and had known Major Butt during the Roosevelt occupancy of the White House, told this story of his heroism. "Archie himself put me into the boat, wrapped blankets around me, and tucked me in as carefully as if we were starting on a motor ride. He himself entered the boat with me, performing the little courtesies as calmly and with as smiling a face as if death was far away, instead of being but a few moments removed from him. When he had carefully wrapped me up, he stepped upon the gunwale of the boat, and lifting his hat, smiled down at me. 'Goodbye, Miss Young,' he said. 'Good luck to you, and don't forget to remember me to the folks back home.' Then he stepped back and waved his hand to me as the boat was lowered. I think I was the last woman he had a chance to help, for the boat went down shortly after we cleared the suction zone." Colonel Astor, another hero. Colonel Astor was another of the heroes of the awful night. Effort was made to persuade him to take a place in one of the lifeboats, but he emphatically refused to do so until every woman and child on board had been provided for, not excepting the women members of the ship's company. One of the passengers describing the consummate courage of Colonel Astor said, "He led Mrs. Astor to the side of the ship and helped her to the lifeboat to which she had been assigned. I saw that she was prostrated and said she would remain and take her chances with him. But Colonel Astor quietly insisted and tried to reassure her in a few words. As she took her place in the boat, her eyes were fixed upon him. Colonel Astor smiled, touched his cap, and when the boat moved safely away from the ship's side, he turned back to his place among the men." Mrs. Ida S. Hippach and her daughter Jean, survivors of the Titanic, said they were saved by Colonel John Jacob Astor, who forced the crew of the last lifeboat to wait for them. "We saw Colonel Astor place Mrs. Astor in a boat and assure her that he would follow her later," said Mrs. Hippach. He turned to us with a smile and said, "Ladies, you are next." The officer in charge of the boat protested that the craft was full, and the seamen started to lower it. Colonel Astor exclaimed, "Hold that boat," in the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and they did as he ordered. The boat had been lowered past the upper deck, and the colonel took us to the deck below and put us in the boat, one after the other, through a porthole. Heartbreaking scenes. There were some terrible scenes. Fathers were parting from their children and giving them an encouraging pat on the shoulders. Men were kissing their wives and telling them that they would be with them shortly. One man said there was absolutely no danger, that the boat was the finest ever built, with watertight compartments, and that it could not sink. That seemed to be the general impression. A few of the men, however, were panic-stricken even when the first of the 56-foot lifeboats was being filled. Fully 10 men threw themselves into the boats, already crowded with women and children. These men were dragged back and hurled sprawling across the deck. 6 of them screamed with fear, struggled to their feet, and made a second attempt to rush the boat. About 10 shots sounded in quick succession. The 6 cowardly men were stopped in their tracks, staggered and collapsed one after another. At least 2 of them vainly attempted to creep towards the boats again. The others lay quite still. This scene of bloodshed served its purpose. In that particular section of the deck, there was no further attempt to violate the rule of women and children first. "I helped fill the boats with women," said Thomas Whiteley, who was a waiter on the Titanic. Collapsible boat number 2 on the starboard side jammed. The second officer